I remember the clinking of glasses, the murmurs of admiration, and the soft glow of candlelight illuminating my mother's face as she stood to give her wedding toast. I should have known then, should have felt the omen in my gut. But I was caught up in the illusion of love, in the magic of the moment, in the naive belief that I had done the right thing by choosing heart over heritage. Mother raised her crystal flute, a smirk playing at her lips, the same one she always wore when she was about to say something particularly cruel, but in a way that no one could call her out for. She had mastered the art of veiling venom in silk. "Can't believe my daughter married a poor orphan. I expected better," she said, her laugh tinkling like wind chimes in a storm. The room stilled just for a fraction of a second, before nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. I laughed too. A weak, obliging sound that did nothing to stop the tightness in my throat. I felt David's hand tense slightly around mine, but he didn't say anything. Of course he didn't. What was he supposed to say? David had spent his whole life proving that he was more than his tragic beginnings. He had worked for everything he had, built himself from the ground up, and made something of himself without anyone's help. But to my mother, to the world we lived in, he would always be the man who had nothing to inherit. I should have defended him. I should have looked my mother in the eye and said something sharp, something definitive, something that would tell her she would never speak about my husband that way again. But I didn't. I just squeezed his hand under the table and gave him a soft, "It's okay" look that I hoped was enough. It wasn't. David was good to me. More than good. He loved me the way every woman dreams of being loved, with devotion, with reverence, with a quiet sort of admiration that made me feel like I was the center of his universe. And in the beginning I thought it was enough. But love can be heavy, and sometimes it smothers. We had a nice life, but it wasn't the life I had imagined for myself. The house was small, the vacations were modest, and while David worked tirelessly to build his own company, we were never comfortable in the way I had grown up being comfortable. There was always a ceiling, always a restraint, always the nagging feeling that I had settled for something less. Mother never said "I told you so," but she didn't have to. She would simply raise a brow when I talked about our budget, or purse her lips when I mentioned how exhausted David was from work. "You could have had more," she'd whisper sometimes, running her fingers through my hair like she was soothing a child. "You still could." I hated her for planting that seed in my mind, and I hated myself for watering it. Then David got sick. Cancer. A word that should have sent me to my knees, that should have brought out the best in me, that should have made me hold his hand and tell him we would get through it together. Instead, all I could think about was how unfair it was. Not just for him but for me. I was barely 30, and I was supposed to spend my best years playing nursemaid? Watching him wither, losing sleep over medical bills, putting my own dreams on hold to carry the weight of his suffering? I knew how this story went. I had seen it play out in movies, in books. The devoted wife stands by her husband's side through every treatment, every battle, sacrificing herself for love. And then what? What if he didn't make it? What if he did but was never the same again? Either way I was losing. I didn't want to be that woman. And Mother knew it. "You have a choice, Elise," she said one night, sitting on my couch with a glass of wine in her manicured hand. "You can chain yourself to his sickness, or you can leave before it destroys you too." "He needs me," I whispered. "And what about what you need?" That was the moment I let myself listen. The moment I started considering a future where I didn't have to wake up every day to the smell of antiseptic and the weight of impending loss. A future where I wasn't tied to a sick man. A future where I could breathe. And so I left. The night I walked out, David was asleep. His body was weaker than I had ever seen it, his face pale, his breath heavy from medication. I told myself I'd say goodbye in the morning, that I'd make it easier. But I knew if I waited I wouldn't be able to go through with it. So I packed my things quietly, took only what I needed, and slipped out the door before dawn. I didn't leave a note. I didn't call. I just disappeared. Mother had a place ready for me. A penthouse in the city, far away from the suffocating weight of sickness and sacrifice. "You deserve this," she told me, handing me a glass of champagne as I stepped onto the balcony overlooking the skyline. "You were never meant for that life, Elise." I drank. I told myself it was for the best. For the first time in months, I exhaled without feeling the weight of someone else's suffering on my shoulders. I didn't think about David. I didn't let myself wonder how he would feel waking up to an empty house. I didn't let myself picture the look in his eyes when he realized I had abandoned him. I just focused on the city lights, the music from the streets below, the feeling of freedom I had reclaimed. And for a while I convinced myself that I had one. But fate has a cruel sense of irony. Months later, as I sat in a lavish restaurant with Mother and her friends, laughing, drinking, living the life I had been promised, the television mounted on the wall flickered to a breaking news segment. The name caught my ear first. David Carter. I turned, my heart slamming into my ribs. And there he was. Healthy, strong, successful. The headline beneath his face read, David Carter, CEO of Carter Enterprises, named one of the wealthiest self-made entrepreneurs of the year. I choked on my drink. David, my David, stood at a podium accepting an award, shaking hands with business tycoons, smiling like a man who had conquered the impossible. He had beaten the cancer. He had built an empire. And I had left him when he was at his lowest. I had abandoned the man who had become unstoppable. And now, watching him on that screen, the bitter realization settled over me like a noose tightening around my throat. I hadn't won anything. I had lost everything. My fingers tightened around the stem of my wine glass, my breath hitching in my throat. The restaurant around me buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the clinking of silverware against fine china. But I couldn't hear any of it. All I could hear was the blood rushing to my ears and the smooth, confident voice of the reporter narrating David's meteoric rise. After surviving a life-threatening battle with cancer, David Carter defied the odds, using his experience as motivation to build Carter Enterprises from the ground up. His company, now worth millions, is one of the fastest-growing businesses in the country, specializing in real estate development and investment. Carter credits his success to perseverance, hard work, and the people who stood by him during his darkest hours. The people who stood by him. The words cut like a blade. I was not one of those people. I had left when he needed me most. The camera panned to him at a gala event, standing before a crowd of elite business leaders, delivering a poised speech. He looked different. Not just healthier but powerful. The frail, tired man I had walked away from was gone. In his place stood someone unbreakable, untouchable. His dark hair, once thinning from chemotherapy, was now neatly styled. His face, once gaunt and tired, was strong and filled with an unwavering confidence. He wore a tailored suit that fit him like a second skin, exuding a presence I barely recognized. My stomach twisted violently. "Isn't that your ex-husband?" one of Mother's friends asked, her voice dripping with intrigue. My, Elise, you didn't mention he was this successful now." I forced a smile, but it felt more like a grimace. I hadn't kept up with him. Mother chuckled, sipping her champagne, utterly unfazed. "Oh please. Wealth doesn't change a man's roots. He's still that poor orphan you married. Some luck and a few good investments don't erase that." But I wasn't so sure. The David on that screen didn't look like a man who carried the weight of his past. He looked like a man who had risen from the ashes and left them far behind. I had been so sure he would crumble without me. I had convinced myself that leaving was the right thing to do, that he would have dragged me down with him, that I deserved better. But looking at him now, I wasn't sure if I had made the right choice. Or the biggest mistake of my life. The car ride home was suffocating. Mother droned on about her friend's latest scandals, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside me. My fingers hovered over my phone, temptation gnawing at me. Should I call him? Text him? Would he even answer? What would I say? "I'm sorry I left you? I didn't think you'd make it? I thought I could do better?" No. There was no way to undo what I had done. I had walked away, leaving him to fight his battle alone. And he had won without me. The realization was crushing. As soon as we arrived at the penthouse, I excused myself and went straight to my bedroom. The city skyline stretched before me through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but for the first time it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a gilded cage. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone, my heart pounding. Before I could stop myself, I opened a browser and typed in his name. David Carter. Hundreds of articles popped up. Business Insider, Forbes, even Vanity Fair had done a piece on him. I clicked one at random. The man who built an empire after beating death. I skimmed through his journey, his near-fatal struggle with cancer, how he had started investing in real estate while recovering, how he had made one smart move after another until Carter Enterprises became a household name. But what made my heart lurch was the last paragraph. When asked about his personal life, Carter remains private. However, at a recent gala he was seen with his longtime business partner and rumored girlfriend, Evelyn Monroe, the CFO of Carter Enterprises. The two were inseparable throughout the night, and sources close to Carter suggest that their relationship extends beyond the boardroom. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. A girlfriend? David had moved on. While I had been living comfortably under my mother's wealth, convincing myself I had chosen the right path, he had found someone else. I told myself I had no right to be angry, no right to be hurt, but I was. Because deep down I had thought that maybe, just maybe, if I ever wanted to go back he would still be waiting for me. That even after everything he would still love me. But he didn't. Not anymore. Sleep didn't come easily that night. My mind refused to rest, replaying every moment, every choice, every mistake I had made. And for the first time since I had left David, I felt something I hadn't expected. Regret. I had walked away from him, believing I was walking towards something greater. But as I lay awake in my bed staring at the ceiling, all I could think was, what if I had stayed? Would I be the one standing beside him at that gala? Would I be the woman he looked at with admiration and pride? Would I be the one he built his empire with instead of Evelyn Monroe? I had traded love for comfort, and in the end I had lost both. And now, the man I had abandoned had become someone I barely recognized. Someone untouchable. Someone I might never get back. I woke up the next morning feeling heavy, my mind still tangled in the thoughts of David. Sleep had been nothing more than a series of restless hours, my subconscious tormenting me with flashes of him. His face the night I left, his frail body wrapped in hospital sheets, his eyes filled with quiet pain. But what haunted me most was the image of him now, powerful and untouchable, standing beside another woman. I couldn't shake the feeling. I told myself it was curiosity, that it wasn't guilt, that I just wanted to see if he was as different in person as he seemed on that screen. I needed to understand how he had transformed from the man I had abandoned into the man who now graced the covers of magazines. I told myself a lot of things that morning, but the truth was simple. I needed to see him again. I spent the day debating with myself, but by evening, my fingers were already dialing the number of a friend I hadn't spoken to in months. Jessica and I had once been inseparable, back when my life still revolved around dinner parties and charity events, before I had allowed myself to disappear into my mother's world completely. She was well-connected, social, and always knew what was happening in the elite circles of the city. She picked up on the third ring. Elise? Wow, I can't believe I'm hearing from you. Where have you been hiding? I forced a light laugh. Just been busy, you know. Life. Well, life must be good if you're finally reappearing. What's up? I heard there's a gala tomorrow night for Carter Enterprises, I said carefully. Are you going? Jessica let out a short, amused breath. So that's why you're calling. Don't tell me you're trying to get a glimpse of your ex-husband. I saw something about him on TV last night. I guess I'm just curious. Curious? She repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. You're telling me you don't regret leaving him now that he's some big-shot millionaire? I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. Of course not. I just want to see for myself how much he's changed. Jessica was silent for a beat before sighing. Well, lucky for you, I do have a plus one. But Elise, if you're going to this, you need to be prepared. Prepared for what? To see him happy, she said bluntly. He's not the man you left behind. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I know. And I did. But knowing something and feeling it were two different things. The gala was being held at one of the city's most prestigious hotels. A venue I had attended many times before, but tonight it felt foreign. The opulence of the chandeliers, the glittering dresses, and the chatter of the elite used to feel like home. Now it all seemed distant. Jessica had been right. I wasn't ready for this. But I was already here. As we stepped inside, I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. The room was vast, filled with elegantly dressed guests sipping champagne and exchanging empty pleasantries. And then, as if the universe had orchestrated it, my eyes landed on him. David. standing near the stage, laughing at something a man beside him had said. The moment I saw him, it felt like the floor had tilted beneath me. He was even more striking in person. Taller, broader, more confident. There was an ease in the way he carried himself, a quiet power in the way people gravitated toward him. He was no longer the man I had known. He was more. And standing beside him, her hand lightly resting on his arm, was Evelyn Monroe. I had seen her picture in the articles I read, but seeing her in person felt like a dagger to the chest. She was stunning, poised, effortlessly sophisticated. The kind of woman who looked like she belonged beside a man like him. I wanted to turn around and leave. I wanted to pretend I had never come. But before I could take a step, David turned his head, and his eyes met mine. The laughter on his lips vanished. His expression didn't change much, but I could see the recognition in his gaze. The slow realization. For a long, excruciating moment, we just stared at each other. Then to my horror he smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't kind. It was the smile of a man who knew exactly who he was now. A man who held all the power. And that was when I realized this wasn't just me confronting my past. This was him confronting the woman who had once left him to die. David's smile lingered, razor-sharp and unreadable, cutting through the distance between us like a blade. My stomach churned. I had spent hours rehearsing what I might say if this moment ever happened, imagining different scenarios where I could somehow explain my choices, soften the blow of my departure. But nothing could have prepared me for this. I could feel Jessica shifting uneasily beside me. "Well," she murmured under her breath. That wasn't the reaction I expected. Neither was I. I had anticipated indifference. Maybe even quiet resentment. But this was something else entirely. Before I could find my voice, David leaned in slightly and murmured something to Evelyn. She turned her head, her gaze flicking in my direction, and I caught the smallest flicker of amusement on her face before she nodded, squeezed his arm and walked away, effortlessly disappearing into the crowd. And then David started walking toward me. I swallowed hard, my body frozen in place. My instinct was to run, to flee before he could reach me, before he could speak, but my legs refused to move. So I stood there, trapped in my own undoing, as the man I had abandoned closed the space between us. "Elise," he said smoothly, his voice deep, rich and carrying an unmistakable edge. "David," I managed, my voice quieter than I would have liked. He looked me up and down, his expression unreadable. "It's been a while." "Yes," I breathed. "It has." A waiter passed by, and David effortlessly plucked a glass of champagne from the tray. His movements fluid and composed. He didn't offer me one. "What brings you here?" he asked, swirling the liquid in his glass. "Curiosity? Nostalgia? Or just looking to see what you missed out on?" The question hit like a slap. I forced a smile, even though my skin burned under the weight of his words. "A friend invited me. I didn't expect to see you." His lips twitched. "No? You came to my company's gala, Elise. That's either the worst case of ignorance or the best lie I've heard all week." Heat rushed to my face. I wanted to deny it, to insist that I had no ulterior motives, but what was the point? He could see right through me. He always could. Jessica cleared her throat, shifting beside me like she wanted to disappear. "I think I'll grab another drink," she muttered before slipping away, leaving me alone with the man who had every reason to hate me. David took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving mine. "So tell me, Elise," he mused. "What have you been up to? Living well, I assume." I hesitated, my mind scrambling for something, anything, that would make my life sound as fulfilling as his. "I've been keeping busy. Traveling. Enjoying life." His brow arched slightly, as if he found that amusing. "Ah, enjoying life. Must be nice." There was something in his tone, something cutting, something unforgiving. A lump formed in my throat. "David, He raised a hand, stopping me. "You don't have to explain, Elise," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I know why you left. And honestly, I should thank you." I blinked. "Thank me?" He tilted his head, studying me like I was an artifact from a past he no longer cared to remember. "Yes. Because if you hadn't walked out, I might not have become this." His words hit harder than I expected. There was no sadness in his voice, no lingering pain. Just certainty. As if my leaving had propelled him forward rather than broken him. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt hollow. "I'm glad you're doing well," I said softly, the words tasting like sand in my mouth. David chuckled under his breath. "Oh, I'm not just doing well, Elise. I'm thriving." I wanted to say something, anything, to shift the power back in my favor, but there was nothing. He had all the control now. He was the one standing tall while I stood there drowning in regret. After a beat, he finished his champagne and set the empty glass down on a nearby table. "I should get back to my guests," he said smoothly. "But it was interesting running into you." And with that he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the sea of power players and billionaires as if I had never even existed. I stood there rooted to the spot, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had come here looking for something. I wasn't even sure what. Closure? Redemption? A second chance? But all I had found was the undeniable truth. David Carter didn't need me anymore. And that realization was more devastating than anything I had ever imagined. I left the gala before Jessica could find me. My hands were shaking as I slid into the backseat of my car, the heavy doors closing me off from the world outside. The moment the driver pulled away, I let out a breath I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. My heart was still racing, my skin hot with the humiliation of that encounter. David had looked at me like I was a relic of a life he had long since buried. I had gone there thinking I could handle it, thinking that maybe I could make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. But all I had done was prove to myself that I wasn't ready, because I had lost him. And worse, he had gained everything. I pressed my fingertips to my temples, trying to force my thoughts into something logical. I needed to stop thinking about him. I needed to remind myself that I had chosen this life, that I had walked away from the sick, struggling man who had needed me, only to return and find him thriving beyond imagination. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I thought about his smirk, his effortless confidence, the way he had toyed with me like I was nothing more than an afterthought, the way he had thanked me for leaving, as if my betrayal had been the best thing to ever happen to him. He was supposed to have broken. He was supposed to have needed me. Instead, he had erased me. The thought made my stomach twist. I pulled out my phone, my fingers hovering over his name in my contacts. I shouldn't text him. I had no right. But something inside me, some desperate, pathetic part of me, needed to hear from him, needed to know if there was anything left of the man I had once called my husband. Before I could stop myself, I typed out a message. "Elise, it was good seeing you tonight. I'd love to catch up sometime." The message sat there, glowing against my screen, waiting to be sent. I hesitated. Then with a deep breath I hit send. And immediately regretted it. The hours passed, stretching out into an endless silence. I checked my phone every few minutes, but there was nothing. No response. Not even a read receipt. I told myself that he was busy, that he probably hadn't seen it. But deep down I knew the truth. He was ignoring me. And I hated how much that stung. I spent the night tossing and turning in my oversized bed, my mind replaying every word, every glance, every subtle shift in his expression. By the time the sun rose, I had reached a decision. I needed to see him again. I didn't know what I would say, or what I was even hoping to accomplish, but I couldn't just let that be our only interaction. I couldn't let him walk away like I didn't matter. So the next morning I did something reckless. I went to his office. Carter Enterprises was housed in one of the tallest skyscrapers in the city, a massive testament to the empire he had built in my absence. The moment I stepped into the lobby, I felt the weight of what I was doing. This was his world now, a world I had no part in. The receptionist, a perfectly polished woman in a crisp black suit, looked up as I approached the desk. "Welcome to Carter Enterprises. Do you have an appointment?" I hesitated. I had been so focused on getting here that I hadn't even considered the logistics. David probably had security measures in place to keep people like me, uninvited ghosts from his past, from just walking in. I was hoping to speak with Mr. Carter," I said carefully. "I don't have an appointment, but Mr. Carter doesn't take walk-ins." Of course he didn't. I swallowed, forcing a smile. "Could you tell him Elise Carter is here? He'll know who I am." The receptionist's polite expression didn't change. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Carter is in a meeting. If you'd like to leave a message, tell him I'm here." I interrupted, my voice firmer than I intended. Please. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before giving me a tight nod. One moment. As she picked up the phone, my heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what I would say to him if he actually agreed to see me, but I never got the chance to find out. The receptionist put the phone down and looked at me with an expression that almost resembled pity. Mr. Carter said he has nothing to discuss with you. The words hit harder than I expected. For a moment, I just stood there trying to process what I had just heard. David wasn't just ignoring me. He was rejecting me. And for the first time since leaving him, I finally understood. I wasn't just a mistake from his past. I was irrelevant, and I stood there frozen, the receptionist's words echoing in my head. Mr. Carter said he has nothing to discuss with you. Nothing. Not even a courtesy meeting. Not even a single word. I had expected anger. I had expected resentment. But I hadn't expected this. The finality of it. Elise. I turned at the sound of my name, my heart skipping a beat as I met a pair of familiar eyes. Raymond Porter. David's longtime friend, his closest confidant, the man who had been the best man at our wedding. He was watching me with an unreadable expression, dressed in a sleek navy suit, his stance exuding the same effortless confidence that David now carried. I forced a smile, trying to mask the humiliation that was burning my skin. Raymond, I said, my voice carefully neutral. It's been a while. It has, he said, his gaze flickering toward the receptionist, who looked like she wanted to disappear. Something tells me this isn't a coincidence. I swallowed, trying to maintain my composure. I just wanted to talk to David. Raymond studied me for a long moment before exhaling sharply. You shouldn't be here, Elise. His tone wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was factual, like he was stating something obvious. I lifted my chin slightly. Why not? He gave me a pointed look. You really have to ask? A wave of frustration bubbled in my chest. I just wanted a conversation, Raymond. That's all. He sighed, rubbing his temples as if he had been expecting this moment and dreading it all the same. David doesn't want to see you. And honestly, I don't blame him. I flinched. It's been years, I said, my voice quieter now. I just wanted to. To what? Raymond cut me off, his voice firm but not raised. To say you're sorry? To ease your guilt? What exactly are you hoping to get out of this? I opened my mouth, then closed it because I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what I wanted. I had convinced myself that I needed closure, but maybe I had just wanted proof that I still mattered. That even after everything, I still held some kind of place in David's life. But I didn't. Raymond sighed again, shaking his head. You left him when he was at his lowest, Elise. And he survived that. Do you really think he's going to let you back in now? Shame curled in my stomach, hot and suffocating. I'm not here to hurt him, I murmured. Raymond's eyes darkened. You already did. The weight of his words pressed against my chest, suffocating and inescapable. For the first time since walking into that lobby, I felt foolish. Desperate. I had spent so long telling myself that David had been the one who needed me, that I had been the one with the power. But I was wrong. He was stronger now. Untouchable. And I was the one left chasing ghosts. Raymond's expression softened just slightly, but there was no sympathy in his gaze. Just quiet understanding. You should go, he said, his voice final. For your sake and his. I nodded stiffly, my throat too tight to speak. Without another word, I turned and walked away, feeling every pair of eyes in the lobby watching me as I left. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap. For the first time, I let myself acknowledge what I had been trying so hard to ignore. David Carter had moved on. And I was nothing more than a mistake he had long since corrected, that I don't remember how I got home. One moment I was stepping out of Carter Enterprises, the city moving around me like I was nothing more than an afterthought, and the next I was standing in my penthouse, staring blankly at my reflection in the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked the same. My makeup was still flawless, my designer dress still hugged my body in all the right ways. But something inside me had unraveled. David had shut me out. Completely. I had prepared myself for hostility, for sharp words, for resentment, even for anger. But not for nothing. Not for indifference. I sank onto the couch, gripping the edge of my dress with trembling fingers. I had built this life, this world where I convinced myself I had made the right decision, that I had chosen security over suffering. But in doing so I had lost him. And worse, he hadn't lost me. He had erased me. I didn't move for hours. Mother called at some point, her voice crisp and poised as it always was. "Did you enjoy the gala?" she asked, the amusement in her tone making it clear that she already knew the answer. I closed my eyes. "It was fine. Lying never suited you, Elise." I let out a slow breath. "What do you want me to say?" "That you finally see what I was trying to protect you from." My grip on my dress tightened. "Protect me?" I echoed bitterly. "You manipulated me into leaving him." Mother let out a quiet sigh, as if my words exhausted her. "I guided you toward making the right decision. And tell me, would you rather be in his shoes now? Would you have wanted to spend years suffering, clawing your way out of nothing just to prove a point?" I didn't answer. Because that was the problem, wasn't it? David had suffered. And I had chosen not to stand by him through it. I heard her sip her wine. "You're upset because he's doing well," she said lightly. "But I promise you, Elise, money doesn't erase a person's past. He'll always be who he was. And you? You will always be better off." The words should have been comforting. Once they would have been. But all I felt was exhaustion. "I have to go," I muttered. "Elise." I hung up before she could finish. I didn't need her voice in my ear right now. I didn't need her justifications, her reasoning, her constant reminders that I had escaped something. Because the truth was, I hadn't escaped anything. I had trapped myself in a life that felt emptier with every passing second. I spent the next day in a fog. I told myself I wouldn't check my phone, that I wouldn't let the silence from David consume me. But I was weak. By noon I had scrolled through every article about him again, watching old interviews, reading every word like I was trying to find some trace of the man I had once known. But there was nothing. He was completely gone. That evening Jessica called. "Elise." Her tone was cautious, hesitant. "I heard you went to David's office." I shut my eyes. "Did Raymond tell you?" "No. People talk. You know how it is." I pinched the bridge of my nose. I thought maybe if I saw him again I could." "Could what?" Jessica interrupted, not unkindly. "Undo the past?" I swallowed hard. She sighed. "I need you to be honest with me, Elise. Do you regret leaving him? Or do you just regret that he survived without you?" Her words sliced through me like a blade. I didn't answer. Because I wasn't sure I knew the answer. "Elise," Jessica said softly, "you don't get to rewrite history. And David isn't the same man anymore. You need to ask yourself if you're chasing him, or just the idea of what he used to be to you." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that I wasn't doing this out of some selfish desire to claim something I had abandoned. But I didn't know if that was true. All I knew was that I needed to see him again. Even if it destroyed me. I barely slept that night. Jessica's words kept looping in my mind, refusing to let me rest. "Do you regret leaving him? Or do you just regret that he survived without you?" I wanted to believe it was the former. That I had made a mistake, that I had let my mother's influence push me into abandoning a man who had only ever loved me. But there was a small, ugly voice inside me whispering that Jessica was right. Maybe it wasn't just about David. Maybe it was about me. Because for years I had convinced myself that I had been the one with the power in our marriage. I had been the one in control. I had left him. But standing in that lobby yesterday, listening to the receptionist tell me he had nothing to say to me, made me realize the truth. David had rewritten the script. He had taken everything from me without even lifting a finger. I wasn't the one who left him behind. He was the one who had moved on. By the next morning I had made a decision. I wasn't done. I wasn't sure what I expected to happen, but I knew I needed to see him again. Not at some gala where he could dismiss me with a cold smirk. Not at his office where his staff could send me away like I was nothing. I needed to see him alone. And that meant finding out where he would be, when his walls were down, when he wasn't surrounded by business associates or cameras. So I did something I wasn't proud of. I called a private investigator. "I usually don't take on these kinds of cases," the man said as he leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the surface of his desk. "What exactly are you hoping to find?" I forced myself to meet his eyes. I just need to know his routine. Where he goes when he's not working. The PI studied me for a long moment before shrugging. Fine. Give me a few days. I felt a sharp pang of guilt as I left his office, but I shoved it down. This wasn't about obsession. This wasn't about interfering with his life. I just needed one conversation. I just needed to know if there was anything left between us. If there was even the smallest part of him that still saw me as more than a mistake. 2 days later I got the call. He plays squash at the club on 5th Avenue every Saturday morning, the investigator said. Drives himself. No security detail. It's the best chance you'll get if you want to accidentally run into him. I swallowed hard. Thank you. Now all I had to do was wait. Saturday morning came faster than I expected. I dressed carefully, choosing a sleek athleisure set that made it look like I had just happened to stop by the club, rather than intentionally waiting for him. My stomach twisted with nerves as I parked outside, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I knew this was reckless, but I was past the point of caring. I spotted him the moment he stepped outside. David. Even in something as simple as a workout shirt and athletic shorts, he still carried himself with that same effortless confidence. His hair was slightly damp from sweat, his expression unreadable as he checked his phone while walking toward his car. For a moment I just watched him. He looked so different from the man I had left. Stronger. Hardened. Untouchable. My heart pounded in my chest as I finally forced myself to move. I stepped out of my car, took a deep breath and called his name. David. He stilled. Slowly he turned to face me. His expression shifted from mild indifference to something colder, sharper. Elise. His voice was calm but devoid of any warmth. What are you doing here? I forced a small smile. I was just in the area. Thought I'd stop by. A flicker of amusement crossed his face, but it wasn't kind. Right. Just in the area. My throat felt dry. Can we talk? David exhaled slowly, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe this was happening. He glanced at his watch. I have a meeting in 30 minutes. I won't take long, I said quickly. I just want to clear the air. He stared at me for a moment, then let out a quiet chuckle. Clear the air, he repeated. At least there is no air between us anymore. There's nothing to clear. I swallowed. Please. Something flickered in his eyes. I hoped it was hesitation. Then to my surprise he nodded. Fine, he said, gesturing toward his car. But make it quick. I let out a breath of relief and followed him as he leaned against the hood of his sleek black BMW, crossing his arms over his chest. Well, he prompted. Say whatever you came here to say. I hesitated. And in that hesitation I realized something terrifying. I didn't know what I wanted to say. I had spent days planning this, chasing him, obsessing over him. But now that I finally had his attention I had nothing. I had abandoned him when he was at his weakest. And now he was letting me stand before him, completely at his mercy. And for the first time I understood. David Carter didn't just move on. He had won. And I had lost. David's gaze was unwavering. His posture relaxed but unreadable. He looked at me the way someone looks at an old book they once read and discarded, like something that no longer held value. I had spent days, weeks, agonizing over what I would say to him if given the chance. But standing here face to face I realized something devastating. There were no words that could fix what I had done. I swallowed hard, willing my voice to be steady. I wanted to see you. A sharp breath of laughter escaped him. But it wasn't amused. It was bitter, condescending. You wanted to see me? He shook his head, looking past me as if searching for patience. Elise, you left me. You made it very clear that I wasn't worth staying for. And now, after all these years, you suddenly want to see me. Shame twisted in my stomach. I know I hurt you, I whispered. Hurt me? His lips curled into a smirk, but his eyes remained cold. Elise, you destroyed me. You walked out when I needed you most. And you didn't just leave, you disappeared. Not a call. Not a message. You let me rot. His words felt like knives, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. I forced myself to meet his gaze. I was scared, David. His jaw tightened. No, he said simply. You were selfish. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had no right to cry. No right to play the victim. I regret it, I admitted. I regret everything. David let out a slow, controlled breath, as if my words meant nothing. Regret, he echoed. You regret leaving me when I was dying? Or do you regret that I survived without you? I flinched. Jessica had asked me the same thing. I hated that I didn't have an answer. My voice cracked. I miss you. David stared at me for a long moment, then let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. Miss me? He pushed off his car and took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. Tell me, Elise, what exactly do you miss? The man you left behind? The one you thought would fall apart without you? His voice dropped lower, his words slow and deliberate. Because he's dead. I sucked in a breath. The man you knew is gone, he continued. He died the night you walked away. I opened my mouth but no words came. For years I had convinced myself that if I ever wanted to come back, there would still be something left between us. That despite everything David would still feel something, anything for me. But I had been wrong. I had spent so much time mourning the loss of him in my life, but it had never occurred to me that he had mourned the loss of me in his, and moved on. I didn't break him. I had set him free. He sighed, glancing at his watch. I have a meeting to get to. Panic rose in my chest. David, wait. He leveled me with a look so cold it sent a shiver down my spine. We're done here, Elise. Something inside me shattered. I had chased him down, desperate for some kind of closure, but all I had found was the harshest truth of all. I no longer mattered. David turned without another word, slipping into his car and shutting the door behind him. A moment later he was gone, and I was left standing there alone, drowning in the weight of my own choices. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at the empty space where his car had been. The realization hit slowly, like ice spreading through my veins. It wasn't just that David had moved on, it was that I no longer existed to him. For years I had convinced myself that if I ever wanted to go back, there would be a path. That even if I had hurt him, even if I had abandoned him at his lowest, there would always be a small part of him that remembered what we once had. But David Carter had done something I never thought possible. He had erased me. Not out of spite. Not out of hate. But because I simply wasn't worth remembering. I don't know how I made it home. I was on autopilot, my body moving while my mind remained stuck in that moment. David's voice sharp and final. The way he had looked at me, not with anger or pain, but with complete and utter detachment. I had thought this was about regret, about making amends, but now I knew the truth. This wasn't about David. This was about me. About the fact that I had spent years pretending I had made the right choice, only to realize too late that I had thrown away the one person who had truly loved me. And now there was nothing left. Mother was waiting for me when I got home, perched elegantly on the couch, a glass of wine in her perfectly manicured hand. I barely made it through the door before she spoke. So how did it go? Her tone was light, indifferent, but there was something in her eyes, something sharp, knowing. I let out a hollow laugh. He doesn't care. Mother sighed, as if I had just confirmed something she had already suspected. I told you, darling. Men like him don't change. I turned to her, my stomach twisting. You don't get it. He has changed. She tilted her head, amusement flickering across her face. Has he? I swallowed the lump in my throat. He's not the same man I left, Mother. He's better. Stronger. He doesn't need me. Her lips curved into a smirk. Then why does it bother you so much? I opened my mouth to argue but nothing came out, because deep down I knew the answer. It wasn't about love. It wasn't even about wanting him back. It was about the fact that I had thought I would always have more time. That I could leave him, chase a life of luxury, and come back when I was ready, when I decided it was time. But life doesn't wait for the people who abandon it. And David Carter had moved on. Without me. Mother took a sip of her wine, watching me over the rim of her glass. I assume this means you'll be letting go of this little obsession now? I swallowed hard. I don't know. She sighed, setting her glass down. Elise, you made the right decision. You chose the life you deserved. I let out a bitter laugh. Did I? Her eyes narrowed. Don't be ridiculous. But I wasn't sure I was being ridiculous. Because as I stood there, my world closing in on me, I realized something horrifying. I had spent years convincing myself that I had chosen comfort over chaos, that I had done what was best for me. But in the end, all I had really done was trade love for loneliness. And there was no one left to blame but myself. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the silence of my penthouse pressing down on me like a weight. David had survived without me. David had thrived without me. And I was the one left standing in the wreckage of my own choices. For the first time since I had left him, I truly understood what I had lost. And I would have to live with that for the rest of my life.